Imagine a world without satellites, without maps drawn to perfect scale, without instant communication across vast distances. A world where the line between peace and war, between your land and mine, could hinge on something as simple as a single stone placed in the earth. These were not ordinary rocks. They were silent sentinels, known as border stones, and they held within their weathered surfaces the power to prevent conflicts, forge unexpected alliances, and communicate the most delicate unspoken agreements between mighty empires. Long before ink touched parchment or digital signatures sealed deals, ancient civilizations from the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia to the disciplined frontiers of Rome relied on these markers to define their world. They were far more than territorial signs. They were the physical embodiment of trust, negotiation, and human ingenuity. Think about that for a moment. In an age we often dismiss as primitive, leaders and diplomats engaged in a subtle dance of power and compromise, using carved stone to say what sometimes could not be spoken aloud. These border stones carried inscriptions invoking gods and curses, symbols of authority and mutual understanding, blending law, religion, and politics into a single, durable record. They were placed with intention along fertile riverbanks, at the edges of mines, on strategic hilltops, each location whispering volumes about the priorities and fears of the people who put them there. From the Hittites and Egyptians who turned battlefields into partnerships, to the Romans who systematized borders with almost scientific precision, these artifacts tell a story of how humanity learned to negotiate space and shared resources without ever picking up a weapon. What's truly astonishing is how relevant these ancient practices feel today. In a modern world filled with complex treaties and digital surveillance, we still grapple with the same fundamental questions. How do we build trust with our neighbors? How do we prevent conflict when resources are scarce? And what unspoken rules govern our relationships, whether between nations or in our own communities? This video is a journey back in time to decode the secrets hidden in these stones, to explore not just what they meant then, but what they can teach us now about diplomacy, territory, and the silent agreements that shape our lives. You're about to discover how the past speaks directly to our present, and why sometimes the simplest objects hold the deepest truths. To truly grasp the profound significance these markers held, we must travel back over 4,000 years to the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. Here, in the world's earliest civilizations, the very concept of a border began to shift from a vague, understood territory to something that needed a permanent, physical declaration. Among the first and most fascinating examples are the Mesopotamian kudurrus. These were not mere rocks picked from a field. They were often carefully carved stone monuments, sometimes even taking on a conical or pillar-like shape. Their surfaces were covered in intricate inscriptions and, most importantly, a rich tapestry of symbols. Imagine a stone etched with images of a serpent, a bird, a scorpion, or a sitting dog. To us, they might look like ancient art, but to a Babylonian farmer or a neighboring official, each symbol represented a specific deity: a crescent moon for the god Sin, a star for Ishtar, a lightning fork for the weather god Adad. This wasn't decoration, it was a divine security system. By inscribing these gods onto the stone, the ruler was effectively placing the property under their protection. A curse wasn't just a threat from the king, it was a promise of supernatural retribution. The inscription might warn that anyone who dared to move this stone or dispute the land would face the wrath of these gods. Their fields would turn to salt, their lineage would end, they would be afflicted with terrible diseases. This blend of legal claim and religious sanction made the border stone incredibly powerful, tapping into the deepest fears and beliefs of the society. Around the same time, along the Nile, the ancient Egyptians were employing their own version, known as boundary stelae. The most famous might be those set up by Pharaoh Akhenaten to mark the sacred precincts of his new capital city, Akhetaten. These stones declared the limits of the city dedicated to the sun god Aten, and were inscribed with elaborate vows from the pharaoh that he would never expand beyond these bounds. But their use was far more widespread than a single, albeit radical, pharaoh. They marked the borders between nomes, the administrative districts of Egypt, and were crucial in a civilization where the annual flooding of the Nile could easily wipe away less permanent markers. The fertility of the land, and thus the wealth and stability of the state, depended on knowing exactly who had the right to which slice of this precious, life-giving riverbank. A boundary stela settled disputes before they could even begin. It was a silent, immovable witness that carried the absolute authority of the pharaoh, who was himself considered a god on earth. So, to violate such a marker was to challenge divine order itself. What's truly remarkable is how this practice, emerging independently in these early cradles of civilization, reveals a universal human need. As societies grew more complex, with agriculture creating surplus and scarcity, with populations expanding and kingdoms forming, the abstract idea of ours needed a concrete form. A border stone made an agreement tangible. It was a contract carved in rock, visible to all, and meant to last for generations. It combined the three pillars that held ancient society together: the political authority of the ruler who ordered its placement, the legal authority that made the claim legitimate, and the religious authority that promised dire consequences for its violation. This powerful combination laid the groundwork for everything that would follow in the long, intricate history of human diplomacy. It was the first step in transforming the chaotic, contested spaces between communities into organized, agreed-upon lines on the landscape. But these stones were far more than just divine scarecrows or royal decrees set in rock. To truly understand their power, we need to look closer, to run our fingers over the intricate carvings and decipher the layered messages they were meant to convey. The surface of a border stone was a carefully composed canvas, designed to communicate with everyone from the highest priest to the illiterate farmer who tended the land. The inscriptions themselves were a feat of multilingual statecraft. In areas where cultures met, it was common to carve the same text in 2 or even 3 languages. This wasn't just for show, it was a critical tool for preventing misunderstandings. By presenting the terms in the native tongue of each party, the agreement became transparent and left little room for deliberate misinterpretation or claims of ignorance. It was a powerful gesture of mutual respect and a practical step toward ensuring the peace would hold. Beyond the words, the symbols told a story all their own. A sheaf of wheat or a cluster of grapes carved into the stone wasn't merely decorative. It was a direct statement about what was being protected: the fertility of this soil, the agricultural wealth that sustained the community. A carved sword or a spear, on the other hand, was a clear and grim promise of military retribution for anyone who dared to cross the line. In Anatolia, Hittite boundary markers sometimes featured powerful animals like lions or eagles, symbols of royal authority and fearsome strength, a constant reminder of the king's watchful eye, even in the most remote parts of the realm. The Romans perfected this symbolic language with their terminus stones, which often featured a carving of the head of the god Terminus himself. The mythology was telling. Terminus was the god who, according to legend, refused to yield his place even to Jupiter, the king of the gods. This made the border stone literally immovable. its inviolability baked into the very foundation of Roman religion and identity. Every choice, from the symbols used to the type of stone selected, was dripping with meaning. A simple, local fieldstone might mark a boundary between two farming villages, a humble but agreed-upon point of reference, but a grand, imported marble pillar inscribed with the names of gods and kings. That was a statement of imperial power, a declaration that this border was not just important to the locals, but to the very core of a vast empire. These markers were the ancient equivalent of a legally binding contract, a public monument, and a sacred religious text, all rolled into one physical object. They encoded the deepest values of the society that erected them, whether it was the Babylonians' profound belief in the ever-present influence of their gods, or the Romans' unwavering focus on law, order, and the absolute authority of the state. To read a border stone is to read the cultural DNA of a civilization, giving us unparalleled insight into what they feared, what they valued, and how they chose to negotiate their place in the world. Yet for all their detailed inscriptions and fearsome curses, some of the most critical agreements these stones represented were never actually carved into their surface. They existed in the silent space between the lines, in the unwritten, mutually understood arrangements that were the true bedrock of ancient diplomacy. Think of it not as a simple property line, but as a handshake deal solidified in stone. The marker itself was the public, undeniable proof of an agreement, but the full terms of that agreement lived in the shared knowledge and context of the people who placed it there. This was a world that operated heavily on trust, reputation, and the powerful principle of reciprocity. A border stone placed along a riverbank, for example, might officially mark the limit of one kingdom's farmland. But the unspoken term, known to both kings and their local governors, was that herders from the other side would be allowed access to the water for their animals at certain times of the day or year. To write that down would be to invite trouble, to create a point of contention that could be debated, violated, or used as a pretext for conflict. By leaving it unsaid, they maintained a crucial flexibility. In a year of drought, that access might be generously expanded as a gesture of goodwill. In a time of tension, it might be temporarily restricted without it being seen as a formal breach of a written treaty. This silent understanding prevented minor issues from escalating into major diplomatic crises. This system of unspoken terms extended far beyond a shared watering hole. A series of border stones marching across a mountain pass might officially define a new frontier, but their placement also silently acknowledged that the narrow trail running alongside them would remain a neutral trade route, open to merchants from both sides. There was no need to inscribe this on the rock. It was in everyone's economic interest. Similarly, a stone erected after a brutal war might be the only physical evidence of peace, but the leaders involved likely had a private understanding about not offering shelter to each other's rebellious factions, or even about coming to each other's aid if a third, common enemy threatened the region. These were the ancient equivalent of a modern gentleman's agreement, but with far higher stakes. The enforcement mechanism wasn't a court of law, but the ever-present threat of reciprocation. If you violated the silent understanding, your neighbor would feel no obligation to uphold their end of the bargain, and you would both lose the immense benefit of that stability. The stone stood as a permanent reminder of that mutual self-interest. This nuanced approach reveals a sophisticated diplomatic philosophy that often prioritized long-term stability over short-term, legalistic precision. Modern treaties can be hundreds of pages long, attempting to anticipate every possible future scenario, which can make them rigid and difficult to adapt when circumstances change. Ancient agreements, by contrast, were frameworks. The border stone set the non-negotiable foundation, the hard boundary, Everything else was managed through an ongoing relationship, a continuous conversation of actions and responses. It was a system built for resilience, allowing relationships between states to breathe and evolve without the constant need for formal and potentially destabilizing renegotiations. The silent agreements were the oil that kept the machinery of ancient international relations running smoothly, preventing the friction of absolute specificity from grinding it to a halt. To truly see this sophisticated system of silent agreements and inscribed power in action, we need look no further than one of the most pivotal moments in ancient history. After decades of bitter rivalry and a brutal, inconclusive battle at Kadesh that left both empires bloodied and exhausted, the Hittites and Egyptians did something extraordinary. They chose to stop fighting, but this wasn't just a simple ceasefire. It was the birth of the first recorded peace treaty in human history, and its terms were immortalized on silver tablets and, most importantly for our story, carved into border stones placed along the contested frontiers. The agreement, forged around 1259 BCE, was a masterpiece of practical diplomacy. It went far beyond a simple promise to not attack each other. The text, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, included specific clauses for the extradition of political refugees and defectors. Imagine the scene. A Hittite official arrives at a newly placed boundary stone to formally hand over an Egyptian fugitive to his homeland's authorities, an act that would have been unthinkable years before during the height of the war. This wasn't just about justice, it was a powerful signal of trust and cooperation, a way to eliminate potential sparks that could reignite the broader conflict. The dual-language nature of these inscriptions was itself a revolutionary act of clarity and mutual respect. By having the same treaty text carved in both languages, both empires ensured there was no room for linguistic trickery or misinterpretation. An Egyptian official could read the hieroglyphic version and a Hittite envoy could read the cuneiform, and they would both be looking at the exact same commitments. This eliminated the dangerous ambiguities that have plagued modern treaties and created a single, shared source of truth. The border stones became the physical anchors of this new reality. They were more than markers, they were permanent, unchanging witnesses to the oath sworn by the two great kings, Ramesses II of Egypt and Hattusili III of the Hittites. Their very presence in the landscape transformed a volatile war zone into a stable, mutually recognized border, a literal line in the sand that both sides had sworn to respect. And the impact of this stone-sealed agreement was profound and lasting. The détente it created didn't just last for a few years, it ushered in generations of peace and unprecedented cooperation between these former enemies. This newfound stability was cemented by a remarkable event about a decade later, a royal marriage. The Hittite king sent his daughter to become a wife in Ramesses' court, a move that would have been utterly impossible without the foundation of trust built by that initial treaty. The border stones had done their job perfectly. They had taken a relationship defined by violence and suspicion and transformed it into a strategic partnership so strong that when a great famine later struck the Hittite lands, Egypt sent shiploads of grain to relieve their former foes. This successful model of using tangible, multilingual markers to define a peaceful relationship didn't go unnoticed. It became a blueprint for diplomacy across the ancient Near East, influencing how other powers like the Assyrians and Babylonians would later negotiate their own boundaries and treaties. It proved that even the most bitter enemies could find a path to peace, and that a simple stone, rightly employed, could be mightier than any army. While grand peace treaties between empires capture our imagination, the true, day-to-day power of border stones was often felt far from the palaces of pharaohs and emperors. Their most vital role was in managing the lifeblood of ancient civilizations, critical resources. In a world where survival and prosperity hinged on access to water, fertile soil, and mineral wealth, these markers were the fundamental tools for preventing chaos and ensuring order. They were the ancient equivalent of a surveyor's plat, a water rights agreement, and a deed of ownership, all carved into a single, immutable object. The placement of a stone could mean the difference between a thriving community and a village plunged into famine, making them instruments of profound practical governance. Consider the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was a civilization built entirely on irrigation. Canals, both large and small, channeled precious water from the rivers to the fields, turning arid land into incredibly productive grain fields. But water is a notoriously contentious resource. Who had the right to dig a canal from the main channel? How much water could an upstream village take before it had to let the flow continue to its downstream neighbors? These were not abstract questions, they were matters of economic life and death. This is where boundary stones, or kudurrus, became indispensable. They were meticulously placed along the banks of canals and at the divergence points of smaller irrigation ditches. A stone might mark the exact spot where one family's water access began and another's ended. By making these divisions physically visible and legally, even divinely, binding, the stones prevented the constant, low-level conflicts that could easily erupt into violent feuds between villages. They ensured a predictable and ideally fair distribution of water, which in turn guaranteed that everyone could plant and harvest their crops with confidence. This system of resource management allowed Mesopotamian society to achieve a level of stability and complexity that would have been impossible in a free-for-all scramble for water. This principle extended far beyond water rights. In regions rich in minerals, border stones defined mining districts. Imagine the copper mines of ancient Cyprus or the silver veins of Laurion in Greece. The right to extract these incredibly valuable materials was a source of immense wealth and power. A border stone placed around a mining area clearly delineated which king, city-state, or noble family held the concession. This prevented rival groups from simply moving in and claiming the wealth for themselves, which would have been a direct act of war. The stone made the claim legitimate and recognizable to all. Similarly, in pasture lands, stones marked the seasonal grazing rights of different nomadic tribes. This was crucial for preventing overgrazing and ensuring that herds could be moved along traditional migratory routes without one group encroaching on the territory another relied on for its survival. The stones were a form of preemptive conflict resolution, acknowledging that while resources might be scarce, a clear and agreed-upon system of sharing could allow multiple groups to thrive. The sophistication behind this process is often overlooked. Placing these stones was not a matter of guesswork or rough estimation. It involved a surprisingly advanced understanding of geography and required careful negotiation. Royal surveyors, using simple but effective tools like measured ropes, sighting poles, and an understanding of basic geometry, would have been sent to precisely map the terrain. Their job was to turn the abstract terms of an agreement into a tangible line on the ground. This often involved difficult compromises. A particularly fertile bend in a river or a hill with a strategic view might be the subject of intense haggling. The final placement of the stone was the product of that negotiation, a silent testament to the art of the deal. It represented a mutually accepted, if not always perfectly desired, outcome. This transformation of vague territorial claims into precise, managed space shows a bureaucratic maturity that we don't always associate with the ancient world. The humble border stone was the final, physical step in a complex process of economic planning and diplomatic compromise, making it one of the most practical and essential tools for building and maintaining a functioning civilization. But perhaps the most powerful tool carved into these stones wasn't a symbol of a god, but a direct threat from one. To understand the true weight of a border marker, we must recognize that its authority didn't come solely from a king's decree, but from a deeply held belief that to move it was to invite cosmic retribution. This was where the legal and the spiritual fused into an irresistible force for compliance. In the ancient mind, the world was not divided into separate realms of church and state. The gods were active participants in daily life, and a boundary sanctioned by them was utterly inviolable. A curse inscribed on a stone was not an empty threat. It was a legally enforceable clause with the divine as its judge, jury, and executioner. We see this vividly with the Greek Horos stones. These markers, used to denote the boundaries of sacred precincts, agricultural land, and even financial mortgages, often carried chillingly simple warnings. One might read, "I am the boundary of the sanctuary, may destruction seize the man who moves me." Another declares, "The gods will hate any man who damages this." The language is direct and terrifyingly personal. It wasn't a fine or a prison sentence that awaited a violator. It was the active, malevolent hatred of the entire pantheon. This promised a punishment far worse than anything a human court could deliver, a curse that could blight your family's health, destroy your harvest, and ensure your name was forgotten for generations. In a society where honor and legacy were paramount, this was a fate worse than death. This system of divine enforcement was brilliantly effective because it created a self-policing society. You didn't need a royal official standing guard at every remote field marker. The fear was internalized. A farmer, knowing the terrible fate that awaited anyone who shifted a stone to gain a few more feet of his neighbor's land, would likely stop his own family from even considering the act. The community itself became the enforcer, united by a shared dread of attracting divine wrath by allowing such a violation to go unchallenged. This gave the border stone a power that extended far beyond its physical presence. It lived in the conscience of every person who knew of its existence. It was a brilliant piece of psychological engineering, leveraging humanity's deepest fears to maintain social order and protect the agreements that held the community together. This practice reveals a profound truth about these ancient civilizations. They understood that for a law to be truly unbreakable, it couldn't just exist in the human realm. It had to be anchored in the moral and spiritual universe. By making a border a sacred object, they elevated a simple property dispute into a sin. This didn't just discourage theft, it protected the very concept of agreement itself. A promise sworn before the gods was eternal. The durability of these pacts, some of which lasted for centuries, stands as a testament to the power of this belief. The stone was merely the physical proof of a covenant that existed on a much higher plane, a constant reminder that some lines, once drawn with the consent of the divine, were never meant to be crossed. While the concept of boundary markers existed for millennia, it was the Romans who transformed it from an art into a precise, state-sponsored science. They took the ancient practice and built a vast, bureaucratic system around it, turning border stones into fundamental instruments of imperial control and cultural assimilation. For the Romans, these markers, known as termini, were not just about marking territory. They were about creating order out of chaos, imposing a rigid, logical Roman structure onto the landscapes and peoples they conquered. This was a civilization that believed in lines, in definitions, in the absolute clarity of what was Roman and what was not. The terminus was the physical embodiment of that worldview. The key to this systematization was a new class of imperial professional, the agrimensors or Roman surveyors. these were not simple laborers. They were highly trained engineers, mathematicians, and military veterans. Deployed across the expanding empire, their mission was to carve the vast, unknown territories into measurable, manageable units. They traveled with a toolkit that was advanced for its time, including the groma, a sophisticated sighting instrument that used plumb lines to create perfect right angles and straight lines across the countryside. With this tool, they could lay out the precise grid patterns of new cities, military camps, and most importantly, the vast agricultural land allocations for retired legionaries. The placement of a terminus was the final, ceremonial act of this meticulous process. These stones were often massive, sometimes reaching waist height, and were inscribed with far more than just a curse. They bore the name of the reigning emperor, the date of placement, and often a specific legal reference to the decree that authorized the boundary. This turned each stone into a permanent piece of imperial documentation, a little piece of Roman law planted firmly in the soil of Gaul, Britain, or North Africa. To see one was to see the undeniable, unchanging authority of Rome itself. This practice was so deeply woven into the Roman identity that it even had its own annual festival, the Terminalia, celebrated on February 23rd. This was not a somber state ceremony, but a vibrant, communal event that brought the abstract concept of the border into the heart of family and community life. Landowners whose properties adjoined would gather with their families at the shared boundary marker. They would decorate the stone with garlands of flowers and offer sacrifices, grain, honey, and wine upon makeshift altars. Songs were sung to the god Terminus, praising him for protecting their land and maintaining the peace between neighbors. It was a powerful piece of social engineering. By making the border stone a focus of celebration and mutual respect, the Romans reinforced its sanctity not through fear alone, but through positive communal ritual. It transformed a cold legal object into a warm symbol of good faith and neighborly cooperation, ensuring that everyone, from the highest senator to the humblest farmer, had a personal stake in respecting the boundaries that held their society together. Beyond the fields of private citizens, the Romans used termini on a grand geopolitical scale to mark the frontiers of their empire, the famous limes. While we often picture these borders as continuous walls like Hadrian's, vast stretches were actually defined by a series of these strategically placed markers, forts, and watchtowers. A terminus placed on a hilltop along the Danube River wasn't just saying Rome ends here. It was a statement of control, a declaration that the empire's power and legal order extended up to this exact point. For the communities living beyond, it was a clear signal of where Roman influence began and ended. This system was brilliantly pragmatic. It allowed the empire to define its zone of control without the immense cost of building and manning endless walls, while still providing a clear, recognizable line for trade, taxation, and military patrols. The Roman approach to border stones was a masterful blend of the practical and the propagandistic. They were tools for organization and conflict prevention, but they were also powerful symbols, constantly reminding both citizens and subjects alike of the enduring, orderly, and all-encompassing power of Rome. Think of the most tense negotiation you can imagine: two rival powers, steeped in suspicion after years of rivalry, finally sitting down to talk peace. In the modern world, the result might be a lengthy treaty, signed in a grand ceremony and then filed away in an archive, out of sight and out of mind. But in the ancient world, the final, most crucial step of that diplomatic process happened not in a palace, but out in the open air, on the very land that had been disputed. The signing of the agreement was one thing. The physical act of placing a border stone was what truly sealed the deal. This was the moment when abstract promises were transformed into concrete reality. These markers were far more than simple signposts. They were the primary instruments of high-stakes diplomacy, designed to make peace last by making it visible, tangible, and incredibly difficult to break. The genius of using a border stone in diplomacy lay in its powerful psychology. A treaty written on papyrus or clay could be hidden, lost, or even destroyed if a ruler later decided it was no longer convenient. But a massive carved stone sunk deep into the earth at a mutually agreed upon location, that was a permanent, public, and profoundly awkward obstacle to betrayal. It stood as a silent sentinel, a constant reminder to both sides of the commitments they had made. For a leader to later violate the agreement, they would first have to order their soldiers to go and uproot that heavy, sanctified object, an act that was not only a huge physical undertaking, but also a blatant, undeniable declaration of hostile intent. There could be no secret maneuvering or plausible deniability. The stone created a bright line that made the consequences of aggression immediately obvious to everyone, effectively raising the cost of breaking the peace so high that it became the least desirable option. It was a brilliant, low-tech method of enforcement that leveraged public awareness and the burden of overt action to maintain stability. This transformative power was especially clear in the world of ancient Greek city-states. These were independent, proud, and often fiercely competitive communities. A disagreement over a few acres of fertile land or a mountain pass could easily spiral into a bloody and costly war. But they also understood the value of cooler heads prevailing. In many cases, rather than fighting to the last soldier, two states would agree to arbitration by a neutral third party, often a respected priest from a shared religious sanctuary like Delphi. The arbitrator would hear both sides, survey the land, and finally decree where the new boundary should lie. The climax of this entire peaceful process was the joint placement of a horos stone by representatives of both cities. This wasn't a chore, it was a sacred ritual, the act of working together to dig the hole, lower the stone, and pack the earth around it was a powerful physical metaphor for building a new foundation of trust. Both sides had a shared investment in the object and the agreement it represented. It was no longer one side's victory and the other's defeat. It was a mutually constructed solution. The stone became a symbol not of division, but of a hard-won consensus. This tangible aspect was key to building the trust that pure diplomacy often struggles to create. A handshake is fleeting. A spoken promise can be forgotten or reinterpreted, but a border stone had weight, both literal and figurative. The resources invested in quarrying, transporting, and inscribing it showed a serious commitment to the agreement. Its enduring physical presence meant that trust didn't have to be taken purely on faith every single day. It was externally reinforced by a monument that said, "We agreed to this." It served as a neutral witness for future generations who had not been part of the original negotiations, providing them with an immutable reference point to prevent new disputes from flaring up over old grievances. In this way, the border stone acted almost as a third party to the agreement, a silent, permanent guarantor of the peace. It moved diplomacy out of the realm of fleeting words and into the domain of lasting, material fact, proving that sometimes the strongest bonds of trust are those that are literally set in stone. The very ground on which a border stone was placed and the direction it faced could speak volumes in a language beyond words. This was the subtle art of geopolitical body language, where the silent messages embedded in a marker's location and orientation were just as critical as the inscriptions carved upon it. A border was rarely a simple, neutral line. It was a statement, and its precise placement was a delicate negotiation of power, respect, and intention, often communicated through carefully calculated gestures. Consider a disputed valley, a lush strip of land fought over for generations. If the stronger empire, after a military victory, chose to place its new boundary stone not at the farthest edge of the valley it could claim, but a few hundred paces back from that point, this was not an act of weakness or poor surveying. It was a profound and strategic concession. By yielding that sliver of territory, the victor was sending a powerful, unspoken message to its rival. We have won, but we seek a lasting peace, not just a humiliating surrender. This gesture is our pledge of good faith. This small act of calculated generosity could do more to secure a stable future than any clause in a treaty, as it addressed the defeated party's pride and offered a tangible sign that the new relationship would be built on something other than pure subjugation. Conversely, the choice to position a marker on the highest hilltop overlooking a contested plain was a move drenched in symbolism and practical threat. This was not about claiming farmland, it was about claiming sightlines. A stone placed on such a strategic Chinese letter was a permanent, silent declaration of surveillance and control. It communicated to everyone on both sides of the line that the power that placed it there was always watching. It dominated the landscape visually, just as the empire that placed it intended to dominate it politically. The message was unmistakable. Our authority does not end at this stone. Our influence and our gaze extend far beyond it. This was a classic tactic of the Romans, who perfected the art of placing their termini on high ground along frontiers like the German line. The stone itself was a legal marker, but its location was a psychological one, a constant and unnerving reminder of the ever-present reach of the legionary fortress just over the horizon. The materials chosen for these markers were equally telling. A boundary between two local villages might be marked by a simple, unhewn boulder pulled from a nearby field, a humble, practical solution that reflected the scale of the agreement. But when an emperor sought to mark the new frontier of his empire, nothing but the finest materials would do. The importation of gleaming white marble or exotic granite from quarries hundreds of miles away was a deliberate and expensive choice. It screamed of resources, permanence, and imperial grandeur. The stone itself became a piece of propaganda. It said, "We have invested immense wealth and effort to be here, and we intend to stay forever." This border is not temporary. It is as enduring and unyielding as this stone. The contrast between a rough local rock and a polished imperial pillar communicated the relative importance of the agreement to the parties involved, creating a hierarchy of borders where some were mere administrative lines and others were the monumental edges of a world power. This sophisticated non-verbal dialogue required an incredible degree of cultural literacy from ancient diplomats. Understanding the nuanced meaning behind the placement of a stone demanded a deep knowledge of your rival's values, their symbols of power, and their definitions of respect and insult. A gesture intended as a compromise could be misinterpreted as a sign of weakness and exploited. A show of strength could be seen as an unbearable provocation. The successful use of this silent language therefore stands as a testament to the professionalism of ancient statecraft. It reveals a world where diplomats were not just negotiators of text, but keen observers of landscape, psychology, and material culture, able to read the intentions of their counterparts in the choice of a hilltop or the quality of stone. It was a high-stakes game where the most important terms of the deal were never written down, but were silently agreed upon every time a surveyor's pole was planted in the earth and a stone was laid to rest. Today's world presents us with a border system that would be utterly unrecognizable to an ancient Babylonian surveyor or a Roman agrimenser. We have moved from stone and symbolism to satellites and legal statutes. Our modern borders are defined by lines of longitude and latitude, by complex treaties stored in digital databases, and are monitored by drones, sensors, and surveillance cameras. The enforcement comes not from the fear of a god's curse, but from the presence of a border patrol agent or the watchful eye of an international monitoring organization. This technological evolution has brought about an unprecedented level of precision and control. A modern border dispute can be settled by referring to satellite imagery with centimeter-level accuracy, a far cry from the sometimes ambiguous placement of a stone marker on a landscape that could change with the seasons. This system is powerful, it is detailed, and it is enforceable on a global scale, creating a framework for international law that allows for trade, travel, and diplomacy across the entire planet. Yet for all its technical brilliance, something profound has been lost in this transition. The ancient border stone was a shared object. It was placed by both parties, often in a joint ceremony, and it stood on the landscape as a monument to a mutual agreement. It fostered a sense of shared responsibility. Both communities on either side of that stone had a vested interest in its preservation because they had both participated in its creation. They saw it, they touched it, and they understood the consequences of its violation on a deeply personal, even spiritual level. A modern border, by contrast, is often an imposed reality. It is a line on a map drawn by distant politicians and bureaucrats, enforced by anonymous officials in uniforms. For the people living near it, it can feel less like a mutually agreed upon boundary and more like a divisive barrier, a symbol of separation rather than cooperation. It lacks the cultural embeddedness, the moral weight, and the communal ritual that gave the ancient stone its enduring power. This difference in feeling leads to a fundamental difference in perception. Ancient borders, for all their divine curses, were ultimately about relationship management. They were tools to facilitate a stable coexistence, to manage shared resources like water and grazing land, and to prevent the kind of ambiguities that lead to conflict. The focus was on the positive outcome of peace. Many modern borders, however, have become heavily politicized symbols of exclusion and national sovereignty. They are often contentious flashpoints, places where the us versus them mentality is physically manifested by walls and fences. The conversation shifts from how we can cooperate across this line to how we can protect ourselves from those on the other side. The impersonal nature of the modern system can make it easier to dehumanize the other, turning a border from a place of meeting and agreement into a fortified line of division. Despite these stark contrasts, the core human impulse remains unchanged across the millennia. Whether it's a 2-ton block of limestone or a virtual line in a mapping software, the purpose is identical: to define sovereignty and to prevent conflict. Both systems are a response to the same fundamental human need for clarity, security, and identity. The ancient Hittite and Egyptian kings wanted to know exactly where their empire ended and their rivals began, just as modern nations do today. They sought to avoid the terrible cost of war, just as we do. The methods and materials have evolved in breathtaking ways, but the underlying goal of creating order from potential chaos is a timeless concern of human civilization. This comparison isn't about declaring one system superior to the other. It's about understanding the trade-offs. We have gained incredible precision and the ability to manage borders on a global scale, but we may have lost the deeper sense of mutual obligation and cultural meaning that made ancient agreements so resilient. This invites a crucial reflection for our contemporary world. Are there elements of the ancient approach that we could reintegrate into our modern diplomacy? In an era of contentious border disputes and rising nationalism, could there be value in creating more tangible, ritualized symbols of agreement? Perhaps the lesson isn't that we should start carving curse-filled stones again, but that we should strive to inject modern border agreements with a greater sense of shared ceremony, mutual respect, and a focus on the benefits of cooperation. The ancient world understood that a border is not just a line that divides, it is also a place where relationships, for better or worse, are defined and maintained. These ancient stones, so vital to the diplomacy of their day, did not simply vanish when empires fell. They remained, often hidden for centuries just beneath the surface of the earth, waiting for the careful hands of archaeologists to unearth them and bring their stories back into the light. Each discovery is a moment of incredible connection, a direct link to a specific day thousands of years ago when a group of people gathered to plant a marker in the soil, forever changing the landscape of power. The remote, sun-scorched hills of Anatolia, for instance, have yielded some of the most telling finds. Here, archaeologists have uncovered Hittite boundary stones that precisely match the descriptions found on clay tablets in the royal archives of Hattusa. It's one thing to read a cuneiform text about a king establishing a new border. It's an entirely different, electrifying experience to find the very stone he commissioned, still standing in its original position. This is where history moves from the theoretical to the tangible. The stone isn't just evidence of a policy, it is the policy itself, frozen in time. It allows us to trace the exact reach of a king's authority, to see how a treaty negotiated in a distant capital was physically implemented on the ground, often in rugged, contested territory far from the center of power. The systematic uncovering of the Roman limes, the empire's vast frontier network, provides another masterclass in how archaeology illuminates ancient statecraft. We can read the historian Tacitus's accounts of Roman military strategy, but it is the physical evidence that shows us the day-to-day reality. Surveyors and archaeologists have meticulously mapped a line of termini stretching from northern Britain all the way to the deserts of Jordan. The placement of these stones is never random. They are found at key strategic points, at the mouth of a valley that could serve as an invasion route, at a fordable point on a wide river, or on a high promontory with a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. Finding a cluster of these stones near the ruins of a small fort tells a vivid story. It speaks of a system where legal boundary markers and military presence worked in perfect concert. The stone defined the limit of Roman law, while the soldiers in the fort provided the earthly enforcement, a constant reminder of the consequences for those who might disrespect the stone's message. This physical evidence allows us to understand the Roman frontier not as a simple line on a map, but as a complex, layered zone of control, observation, and managed interaction. Perhaps the most profound contribution of these archaeological finds is their ability to correct the historical record or give a voice to those who lacked one. The official histories of ancient empires were often written by the victors, glorifying the ruler and his conquests, but a boundary stone tells a more nuanced story. A discovery in Mesopotamia might reveal that a king we thought was all-powerful actually had to negotiate a boundary with a smaller, neighboring city-state, a fact he would never have proudly recorded in his own annals. The stone stands as silent, unbiased testimony to a compromise he was forced to make. In this way, these artifacts democratize history. They provide evidence for the interactions of smaller kingdoms and communities that left no written records of their own. By studying the distribution and inscriptions of these markers, archaeologists can start to reconstruct entire forgotten diplomatic networks, understanding who was negotiating with whom, and how power truly flowed across a region, not just from the top down, but through a complex web of lateral agreements and mutual understandings. Each of these unearthed stones is a crucial piece in the grand puzzle of our shared human past. They transform our understanding from a flat, two-dimensional narrative based on texts into a rich, three-dimensional reality. We move from knowing that the Romans had a frontier to being able to walk the very path a Roman surveyor walked, to stand at the stone he placed, and to see the landscape exactly as he saw it, understanding the tactical and diplomatic calculations that went into that precise placement. Archaeology does more than just confirm what we've read. It adds texture, depth, and a human scale to the sweep of history. It bridges the immense gap between the abstract idea of an ancient treaty and the gritty, practical reality of how that treaty was enacted and maintained, giving us a complete picture of how our ancestors managed to build a fragile order in a complex and often fractious world. This deep-seated need to define and defend our space isn't just a cultural quirk. It's woven into the very fabric of our human psychology, a fundamental drive that helps explain why a simple stone could hold such immense power for thousands of years. At its core, territoriality is an ancient survival mechanism, a hardwired instinct we share with countless other species. For our earliest ancestors, clearly knowing where your hunting grounds began and ended, or which grove of trees your group relied on, was a matter of life and death. It was about securing access to food, water, and shelter, the essential resources that allowed a community to not just survive, but to thrive. This instinct also forged a powerful sense of group identity. Knowing where we ended and they began created a crucial social boundary, fostering cooperation and trust within the group while defining those outside it. This us versus them dynamic, while potentially divisive, provided a clear structure that reduced social uncertainty and strengthened communal bonds. What ancient civilizations did with border stones was nothing short of brilliant. They took this raw, primal, often aggressive instinct and channeled it into a constructive social institution. They transformed an unconscious impulse into a conscious, agreed-upon system. Imagine the constant, low-grade anxiety that must have existed in regions WITH Chinese letter contested boundaries. Every time a shepherd from one village grazed his flock a little too close to another's land, or a foraging party wandered into a disputed forest, it had the potential to spark a violent confrontation. This ambiguity is psychologically taxing. It creates a state of perpetual vigilance and suspicion. The simple, unambiguous presence of a border stone dramatically lowered that anxiety. It replaced uncertainty with clarity. Everyone knew exactly where they stood, literally and figuratively. This clarity didn't just prevent fights, it freed up mental and social resources. Instead of constantly worrying about defending a vague perimeter, communities could focus their energy on farming, building, trading, and innovating. The border stone acted as a psychological release valve, reducing the tension that naturally builds up when territories are unclear. This system effectively redirected humanity's territorial impulses from destructive pathways toward cooperative ones. The innate drive to defend what's ours wasn't eliminated. It was simply given a clear, mutually recognized, and non-negotiable focal point. There was no need for a preemptive strike or a show of force over a boundary everyone could see and agree upon. The energy that would have been spent on conflict was instead channeled into respecting the agreement and managing the relationship across that now stable border. This is why these markers were so effective and enduring. They didn't fight human nature, they worked with it. They addressed our profound, deep-seated psychological needs for security, for clarity, and for a defined sense of place in the world. By making the invisible lines of territory visible and permanent, they provided a sense of order in a chaotic world, satisfying a fundamental human yearning for predictability and safety. The border stone, therefore, was more than a political tool or a religious object. It was a psychological masterpiece, a testament to our ancient ability to recognize our own baser instincts and build systems to elegantly manage them for the greater good. But for all their symbolic weight and psychological power, these stones would have been little more than scenery without the force of law standing firmly behind them. The truly revolutionary step ancient societies took was to weave these physical markers directly into the very fabric of their legal systems, transforming a carved rock from a suggestion into an enforceable decree. Across civilizations, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the hills of Judea, the act of tampering with a boundary marker was not merely a trespass. It was one of the most severe crimes a person could commit, an offense that struck at the heart of social order and economic stability. This wasn't a matter of simple property law. It was about protecting the foundational agreements that prevented communities from descending into chaos. We find some of the most explicit and enduring legal condemnations in the texts of the Hebrew Bible, where the act is denounced not once but multiple times. The book of Deuteronomy issues a stark warning proclaiming, "Cursed be anyone who moves a neighbor's landmark." This was more than a spiritual admonition. It was a direct reflection of the legal codes of the time. The book of Proverbs reinforces this, cautioning against seizing the landmark of the fatherless, framing it as a vile act of exploitation against the most vulnerable. These repeated injunctions reveal how deeply the sanctity of the boundary was embedded in the collective conscience. The law recognized that if a single farmer could surreptitiously shift a stone under cover of darkness to gain a sliver of his neighbor's field, the entire delicate system of land ownership and inheritance could unravel, leading to generational feuds and the potential collapse of local agriculture. The punishment prescribed was often extreme, ranging from heavy fines and reparations to corporal punishment or even death, a clear signal that the crime was considered a threat to the entire community's welfare, not just a private dispute between two individuals. Enforcement, however, looked nothing like our modern system of centralized policing. There were no ancient border stone patrols. Instead, the system relied on a sophisticated, decentralized model of community vigilance. The responsibility for protecting these markers fell to everyone. Neighbors watched neighbors, local elders, village heads, and regional governors acted as judges and arbiters when a stone was found disturbed. This created a powerful system of social oversight where everyone had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. If you saw someone meddling with a marker, reporting it wasn't just about being a good citizen. It was about protecting your own security and the collective stability of your community. The stone itself was the primary witness in any dispute. In a world before detailed property maps and title deeds, its location was the incontrovertible evidence. A court case would often involve the local authorities physically visiting the site to see the marker for themselves, hearing testimony from those who remembered its original placement. This practice made the law tangible and immediate, grounding justice in the physical reality of the landscape. This legal framework elevated the border stone from a passive symbol to an active, functional component of the justice system. It was a fixed point of reference in a potentially fluid world, a silent judge that always told the truth. A king's decree might be challenged or forgotten, but the stone in the ground remained, an immutable testament to an agreement that carried the full weight of the law. This combination of severe legal penalties and communal enforcement created a remarkably durable system. It ensured that the pacts carved into stone were not just hopeful promises or abstract religious ideals, but actionable, living contracts that shaped daily life for centuries, proving that the strongest laws are those that are rooted in the land itself and guarded by the people who live upon it. The fascinating thing about this universal human drive to mark territory is that no two cultures did it in exactly the same way. While a Babylonian kudurrus and a Roman terminus might share a common purpose, the philosophy behind them, the symbols they used, and the very reasons for their existence could be worlds apart. These variations are like a cultural fingerprint, revealing what each civilization held most sacred, what they feared, and how they saw their place in the natural order. The concept of the border was a blank canvas, and every society painted it with the unique colors of their own beliefs and environment. Consider the ancient Chinese approach, which was deeply influenced by the principles of Feng Shui. For them, the landscape was alive with energy or kai, and the placement of any structure, including a boundary marker, had to be in harmony with these natural forces. A border wasn't just a line between two administrative districts. It was a feature that needed to align with the surrounding mountains, rivers, and wind patterns to ensure prosperity and stability for the communities on both sides. A marker placed against the natural flow of the land could, in their view, bring misfortune, blocking the positive energy that sustained agriculture and health. Therefore, the process of demarcation involved not just surveyors, but also diviners and astrologers who would read the environment to find the most auspicious location. The marker itself might be a simple stone pillar, but its placement was a profound act of balancing human needs with the perceived will of the natural world. It was less about asserting dominance over the land and more about finding a respectful, harmonious place within it, a philosophy that turned the act of border making into a form of spiritual geography. On the other side of the globe, the Maya of Mesoamerica took a dramatically different approach. Their boundary markers were often grandiose stone monuments known as Steli. But to call them mere border stones would be a vast understatement. These towering, intricately carved slabs were multifaceted masterpieces that blended politics, history, art, and religion into a single, imposing object. A Maya stela would typically feature a larger-than-life depiction of the ruling king, often dressed in elaborate ritual garb and standing triumphantly over captured enemies. The sides and back would be covered in hieroglyphic text, not just stating the boundary, but recording the date of its establishment, the king's illustrious genealogy, and a recounting of his military victories or divine rights that legitimized his rule. The marker was a permanent advertisement of royal power, designed to awe any subject or rival who saw it. It communicated a clear message: this land is not just under my control, it is a part of my identity and my legacy, forever cemented into history by this stone chronicle. The border was a stage for celebrating the king's achievements, making the marker itself a piece of political theater and a sacred archive. Meanwhile, in the Andes, the Inca Empire employed a system that reflected their highly organized, bureaucratic state. They used piles of stones called surveyors or more formal structures to mark boundaries along their vast network of roads, which stretched over thousands of miles. These markers were less about artistic glorification of a single ruler and more about practical administration. They delineated the boundaries of different eyeless kinship groups and the extensive state-owned farmlands and terraces that fed the empire. The placement was systematic and precise, serving as a point of reference for runners carrying messages and for officials managing the movement of goods, troops, and labor across the empire's complex topography. The Inca system prioritized functionality and control, turning the landscape into a manageable grid that supported their centralized economy. The marker was a cog in a much larger machine of statecraft, demonstrating a pragmatic approach to territorial management that was every bit as sophisticated as the Roman model, yet born from a completely different set of cultural and environmental needs. Even within the same broader region, nuances abounded. In ancient Greece, the sacred horos stones that marked the boundaries of temple precincts were treated with utmost reverence, their violation considered a direct offense to the gods. Yet, the stones used to mark the edges of a private farm or a public marketplace were more utilitarian, though still protected by law. This shows a single culture applying different levels of spiritual and legal significance to the same basic object based on its context. The universal need to define space was constant, but the meaning imbued in that act was beautifully, wonderfully diverse. From the Chinese harmonizing with energy flows to the Maya glorifying their kings, and the Inca administering an empire. Each civilization looked at the same fundamental problem and devised a solution that was a perfect reflection of its own soul. But the power of these stones extended far beyond the realms of law and field surveys. They were deeply woven into the very myths and legends that gave meaning to the ancient world. These stories transformed the practical marker into a sacred object, a divine gift that carried the weight of cosmic order. Perhaps no myth is more telling than that of the Roman god Terminus. When the Romans sought to build a grand temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, the legend says that all the gods willingly vacated their shrines to make way for the king of the gods, all except one. Terminus, the god of boundaries, flatly refused to budge. His sacred stone could not be moved. Rather than seeing this as an act of defiance, the Romans interpreted it as a sign of profound importance. They built the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus around Terminus's stone, incorporating it right into the design. A small hole was even left in the ceiling above it so that the god, whose power was tied to the open sky, could still receive sacrifices. This wasn't just a quirky architectural feature, it was a powerful theological statement. It declared that the authority of a boundary was so fundamental, so absolute, that it even took precedence over the will of Jupiter himself. The boundary stone was literally immovable, a concept so vital to Roman identity that it was baked into the foundation of their most important religious site. This theme of divine immovability echoes across other cultures. In ancient Greece, there was a widespread belief that certain boundary markers, especially those surrounding sacred groves or temple precincts, had been placed there by the gods themselves or by mythic heroes like Heracles at the dawn of time. To disturb such a stone was not merely to break a man-made law, it was to disrupt the very order of the universe as the gods had ordained it. These stories served a crucial psychological purpose. They answered the why. Why should we respect this line? Why is this particular rock so important? The myth provided the answer because the gods decreed it so. This gave the rule a legitimacy that far exceeded any earthly king's command. It rooted the social contract in the bedrock of divine will, making compliance a sacred duty rather than just a legal obligation. The stone became a tangible point of contact with the divine, a place where the mundane world of property law intersected with the majestic order of the cosmos. The narrative power of these myths was also used to deliver stark moral lessons, often warning of the catastrophic consequences of disrespecting boundaries. Folk tales from across Europe and Asia frequently featured a greedy farmer who, under cover of night, would move the marker between his field and his neighbors to steal a few extra feet of land. The stories never end well for the thief. His crops would fail, his family would fall ill, or he would be struck by lightning. A clear and terrifying lesson about the dangers of covetousness and the inevitable downfall that comes from violating a trusted agreement. These were not just simple ghost stories told around a fire. They were a form of cultural education. They reinforced the idea that the community's stability depended on every individual's personal honesty and respect for these agreed-upon lines. By making the boundary marker the central object in a morality play, These tales embedded the importance of territorial integrity into the collective conscience of every generation, teaching children from a young age that some lines are never to be crossed. In this way, the imagination became one of the most powerful tools for maintaining social order. The myths and legends surrounding border stones did something that laws and curses alone could not always achieve. They made boundaries feel righteous, natural, and inevitable. They removed the concept from the realm of human negotiation and placed it firmly in the realm of natural law, as fixed and unchangeable as the seasons or the rising of the sun. A person might be tempted to argue with a tax collector or even a king's soldier, but who would dare to challenge a decree from Jupiter or risk the wrath of a local river spirit? By wrapping the practical necessity of borders in the compelling cloak of story, ancient societies leveraged their most powerful cultural force, their shared mythology, to support the real-world structures that allowed them to function peacefully. The stone in the field was no longer just a rock. It was a character in an epic story, a silent guardian of order, and a permanent reminder that some agreements are meant to last forever. These clearly defined borders created predictable and secure corridors for commerce, acting as a powerful stimulant for long-distance trade. A merchant setting out from a Phoenician port with a cargo of dyed fabrics and glassware, or from Mesopotamia with a load of grain, could plan his journey with far greater confidence if he knew the route was marked by recognized boundary stones. These markers signaled that he was moving through territory where the authority of a known king or city-state held sway, and where the rule of law, at least in theory, protected travelers from arbitrary predation. The presence of a border stone effectively extended a ruler's guarantee of safety along the road, reducing the ever-present threat of bandits who thrived in lawless, unclaimed hinterlands. This security was the lifeblood of ancient economies, encouraging merchants to undertake risky, long-haul journeys that connected disparate cultures and spread not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and artistic styles across the ancient world. The border stone, in this sense, wasn't a barrier to interaction. It was its essential facilitator, creating the stable conditions necessary for exchange to flourish. This system of managed movement was formalized at specific points where borders intersected with major trade routes. Here, the humble boundary stone often evolved into something more, a customs post. A large, prominently placed marker might signify the location where goods were to be declared, inspected, and taxed. Officials stationed at these points would check cargo against the regulations of their state, collecting import duties or transit fees that filled the royal coffers. For the ancient traveler, this was the equivalent of a modern border checkpoint. The stone marked the precise spot where one economic zone ended and another began, with its own set of rules and tariffs. This wasn't merely about revenue generation, it was a tool of economic policy. A kingdom could use these border taxes to protect its own industries by making foreign goods more expensive, or to encourage the import of Chinese letter materials it lacked. The physical marker made this entire system legible and predictable. Everyone knew where the tax was due, reducing corrupt shakedowns by local strongmen and creating a standardized, if not always welcome, part of the cost of doing business. Yet, for all the economic opportunities they created, these same borders could also act as instruments of exclusion and control, powerfully reinforcing existing social hierarchies. The very clarity that protected the merchant could also be used to wall off access to privilege and resources. In highly stratified societies like Egypt or Babylon, the right to move freely across certain boundaries was not a universal right but a privilege granted by status, wealth, or occupation. A boundary stone marking the entrance to a sacred temple precinct or a royal administrative district was an unambiguous message to the vast majority of the population: do not cross. This physical demarcation of space codified social inequality into the landscape itself, creating visible zones of exclusion where access was granted only to priests, officials, and elites. For the common farmer or laborer, their entire world might be circumscribed by the border stones of their village and the surrounding fields, their mobility permanently limited by the accident of their birth. This tension between openness and control reveals the fundamental duality of ancient borders. They were never simply one thing. They were both a gateway and a gate. They could simultaneously encourage the flow of luxury goods and elite diplomats while rigorously restricting the movement of the poor, the enslaved, or socially marginalized groups. A network of border stones might define a safe international trade route, but that same network also delineated the internal boundaries that kept different social classes in their assigned places. This complex reality shows that ancient societies were constantly negotiating a balance. They understood the immense economic benefits of connectivity and exchange, but they also fiercely prized social stability, which often meant controlling who could go where. The border stone was the perfect tool for this delicate balancing act, a permanent, silent, and utterly inflexible arbiter that shaped the rhythms of everyday life, determining everything from where a merchant could sell his wares to where a farmer could draw his water, proving that the lines we draw on the land are never just about territory. They are ultimately about defining the very possibilities of human life itself. This sophisticated dance of the unspoken deal, so perfectly captured by those ancient stones, never actually went away. It simply evolved, trading carved rock for quiet conversations in the corridors of power, proving that some of the most important rules governing our world are the ones never officially written down. Modern international relations are absolutely saturated with these silent agreements, functioning on a level of trust and nuance that often makes formal treaties look clumsy and rigid by comparison. Think about the most tense standoffs of the last century. During the darkest days of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a nuclear stalemate, a terrifying balance of power that was maintained not just by the pages of arms control treaties, but by a web of deeply understood, unspoken rules. Neither side ever formally agreed not to deliberately provoke the other into an apocalyptic war, but that was the fundamental, silent understanding that prevented every minor skirmish from escalating into a global catastrophe. This concept of mutually assured destruction was the ultimate silent agreement. It required no signature, only a grim, mutual recognition of reality and a shared, unvoiced commitment to avoiding mutual suicide. We see this principle actively at work in the world's most heavily fortified border, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. While the armistice agreement that created the DMZ is a formal document, the day-to-day stability along that tense frontier is governed by a complex set of tacit understandings that go far beyond the written text. Both sides understand, for instance, the unspoken limits of provocative actions. They might post soldiers right at the edge of the line, but there's a mutual, unacknowledged agreement to avoid any movement that could be misinterpreted as an imminent attack. This allows both governments to project strength to their domestic audiences without accidentally triggering a conflict that neither side actually wants. It's a high-stakes game of chicken where the most important rule is the one nobody ever says out loud, because to formalize it would be to admit vulnerability or a limit to one's own resolve. This provides both sides with what diplomats call plausible deniability, the ability to navigate a crisis without losing face or being held legally accountable for bending a formal rule. This same logic applies to the enduring concept of spheres of influence, a term that itself is a modern diplomatic euphemism for a silent agreement between major powers to respect each other's backyard. There is no signed and sealed global treaty where the United States, China, and Russia sit down and draw lines on a map, officially granting each other zones of control. Instead, there is a deeply ingrained, tacit understanding that certain actions in certain regions will be tolerated, while others will be met with fierce resistance. For decades, the United States has largely refrained from challenging Russian dominance in its immediate neighboring states, just as Russia has understood the profound consequences of meddling militarily in Latin America. These are not hard legal boundaries, but soft, flexible zones of understood interest that allow the great powers to compete without constantly stumbling into direct, catastrophic confrontation. They are the modern equivalent of that ancient border stone placed a strategic distance back from the river, a silent concession that acknowledges a rival's priority in a given area without ever formally admitting it, preserving flexibility for the future. The reason these tacit arrangements persist so powerfully is that they address a fundamental flaw in formal diplomacy, the same flaw the ancients understood, which is the inability to predict the future. A written treaty is frozen in time, a product of the specific circumstances and knowledge available the day it was signed, but the world is fluid and constantly changing. A silent agreement, by contrast, is living and adaptable. It can evolve with the relationship between the nations, allowing for quiet adjustments in response to new leaders, new technologies, or new global threats without the political drama and potential backlash of publicly renegotiating a binding contract. This system operates on a currency of trust and reciprocity, much like it did thousands of years ago. A nation will uphold its end of a silent bargain because it knows that violating that trust would not only collapse the current understanding, but would also poison the well for any future informal deals, leaving only the brittle, dangerous framework of formal ultimatums and legalistic rigidity. In the high-stakes game of global politics, that kind of flexibility and trust, even between adversaries, is often the most valuable asset a diplomat can have. Yet for all their resilience, these silent sentinels of diplomacy now face a slow, quiet crisis. Exposed to the relentless elements for centuries, many ancient border stones are succumbing to the very forces they were meant to defy. The same rain and wind that once smoothed their surfaces now threaten to erase the delicate inscriptions that hold their historical meaning, but the natural world is only one adversary. In our modern age, these monuments are increasingly vulnerable to human activity, vandalism from those who do not recognize their significance, theft by looters seeking to sell a piece of history on the black market, and perhaps most devastatingly, the relentless march of urban development and industrial agriculture. A stone that has stood for 3,000 years, marking a truce between forgotten kingdoms, can be shattered in an instant by a bulldozer clearing land for a new highway or a shopping mall, its story lost forever beneath a layer of asphalt. Each stone that disappears is not just a rock being removed. It is a unique page torn from the book of human history, a vital piece of evidence about how our ancestors navigated conflict and built understanding, simply vanishing without a trace. The fight to save these artifacts is a race against time, and it is fraught with immense challenges. Archaeologists and heritage organizations dedicated to their preservation often operate with shoestring budgets, forced to make heartbreaking choices about which sites to protect. The work is painstaking and expensive, requiring not just initial excavation and stabilization, but ongoing maintenance to prevent further decay. Furthermore, there is a critical battle for public awareness. A local farmer might view a strange, carved rock in his field as a nuisance, an obstacle to plowing a straight line, rather than recognizing it as an international treasure. Without a widespread understanding of their profound importance, these stones have no defenders in their immediate environment. leaving them incredibly vulnerable to accidental or deliberate destruction. Gaining the cooperation of landowners and local communities is just as crucial as securing government grants, turning everyday citizens into the first line of defense for these fragile links to our past. In response to these threats, preservationists have developed a two-pronged strategy, each approach with its own unique strengths. One method involves physically removing stones from their original locations and placing them in the controlled, protective environment of a museum. This certainly saves them from weathering and vandalism, allowing experts to conserve them and making them accessible for millions of visitors to see and learn from. However, this process, often called museumization, comes with a significant cost. A border stone in a museum display case, lit by soft LEDs and accompanied by a descriptive plaque, is safe, but it has been severed from its context. Its power was always derived from its specific place in the landscape, its view of the valley it guarded, its relationship to the river it helped share, its position on the ancient road it once monitored. When you move the stone, you lose that tangible connection to the geography and the strategic thinking that led to its placement. It becomes an artifact of art and inscription, but its soul as a functional piece of diplomacy, rooted in a specific spot of Earth, is diminished. This is why the most valuable efforts today focus on in situ conservation, protecting the stones right where they have stood for millennia. This approach is far more complex than a simple excavation. It involves creating protective shelters over the stones to shield them from rain and sun, stabilizing the surrounding soil to prevent subsidence, and even using non-invasive techniques like laser scanning to create perfect digital records without ever touching the original artifact. The ultimate goal is to develop sustainable tourism around these sites, building boardwalks and viewing platforms that allow people to witness history in its true setting without causing damage. This turns the stone back into a destination, a place of pilgrimage where one can stand exactly where an ancient surveyor stood and understand the vista they sought to control. This method preserves not just the object itself, but the entire story embedded in its location, maintaining its authentic power and meaning for generations to come. These preservation efforts are about far more than just saving old rocks. They are about safeguarding the physical proof of humanity's earliest attempts to choose negotiation over annihilation. Every time we protect one of these stones, we are preserving a monument to a successful peace treaty, a hard-won compromise, a moment where dialogue triumphed over violence. In a world still riddled with border conflicts and territorial disputes, these ancient markers serve as powerful, tangible reminders that the impulse to create order through agreement is not a modern invention, but a fundamental and enduring part of the human story. They are touchstones in every sense of the word, connecting us directly to the timeless challenges of diplomacy and the universal hope for a more stable, peaceful world. To truly understand why these stones held such power, we must step back and view them through the lens of deeper human instincts, exploring the very theories that explain our primal need to draw lines in the sand or in stone. One of the most compelling frameworks comes from the geographer Robert Sack, who defined territoriality not just as a simple claim of space, but as a sophisticated strategy. He saw it as a primary human tool for influencing, controlling, and asserting power over both people and precious resources. Think of it not as an innate aggression, but as a calculated method for simplifying how we manage our complex world. By creating a clear boundary, a ruler could control access to a fertile river plain or a strategic mountain pass without having to station a soldier behind every single tree. The border stone became the ultimate symbol of this strategy, a low-cost, high-impact tool for projecting authority across vast distances. It was a way of making the abstract concept of control tangible, permanent, and recognizable to everyone, from the highest official to the most remote farmer. This theory transforms our view of these artifacts. They weren't just markers, they were the physical execution of a powerful psychological and political strategy to bring order to a chaotic world. This drive for control, however, is only one side of the coin. Another profound perspective comes from anthropology and social psychology, which tells us that borders are fundamental to the very concept of identity. From the moment early humans formed tribes, the need to define us versus them became a cornerstone of social cohesion. A shared territory, clearly marked and defended, creates a powerful container for a group's culture, language, laws, and traditions. The border stone made this abstract social boundary physically real. It was a constant, visible reminder of who belonged inside the circle of protection and shared identity, and who existed outside of it. This wasn't necessarily about hostility toward outsiders. It was about strengthening the bonds within the group. Knowing where your community ended provided a crucial sense of security and belonging, reducing the social uncertainty that can fray the edges of a society. The stone gave tangible form to the invisible lines of kinship and citizenship, turning a collection of individuals into a cohesive people with a shared stake in a defined piece of the earth. These two powerful forces, the strategy of control and the need for identity, are not opposing ideas, but rather two threads tightly woven together in the fabric of human civilization. The ancient rulers who commissioned these stones were masterfully leveraging both. By marking a border, they were simultaneously asserting their political power and reinforcing the collective identity of their subjects. A citizen living within the ring of boundary stones knew they were under the pharaoh's protection and subject to his laws, but they also knew they were Egyptian, distinct from the Hittites or the Nubians on the other side. The stone managed resources and people, but it also nurtured a sense of shared destiny. This dual function helps explain the incredible enduring power of these objects. They appealed to both the rational mind by creating order and predictability, and to the emotional heart by fostering a powerful sense of place and belonging. They satisfied our deepest instincts for both security and community. When we apply these theoretical lenses to the ancient border stone, it ceases to be a lonely relic and transforms into a brilliant key for unlocking universal human behavior. The urge that drove a Babylonian king to carve a kudurrus and place it along a canal is the same fundamental impulse that drives a modern nation to patrol its airspace or a suburban homeowner to build a fence. The scale and the technology change dramatically, but the underlying psychological script remains remarkably consistent. We are a species that constantly seeks to create order, to define our space, and to understand our place in relation to others. These stones are perhaps the purest and most durable expression of that timeless endeavor. They show us that our modern debates over immigration, sovereignty, and globalism are not merely political inventions of the last few centuries, but are instead the latest chapters in an ancient, ongoing story about how we negotiate our shared existence on this planet. They connect the strategic mind of a Roman emperor to the social instincts of our earliest ancestors, revealing a continuous thread of human behavior that stretches across thousands of years, reminding us that our most contemporary conflicts and agreements are deeply rooted in the very essence of who we are. Perhaps the greatest testament to the power of these stones lies not in the grand treaties they memorialized, but in the countless conflicts that never happened because of them. Their primary role was not to end wars, but to prevent them from ever starting by transforming the most dangerous landscapes, those of ambiguity and misunderstanding, into territories of absolute clarity. In the ancient world, where a king's pride was as potent a weapon as his army, a Chinese letter or contested border was a perpetual spark waiting to ignite a conflagration. The fertile plains between the constantly warring city-states of ancient Mesopotamia and Greece were perfect examples of this tinderbox effect. A river might shift its course after a spring flood, subtly altering the landscape and erasing the informal markers a community had used for generations. A shepherd from one city might, in good faith, graze his flock on a hillside that shepherds from a rival city considered theirs. Without a fixed, permanent, and mutually recognized point of reference, these minor incidents could rapidly spiral into raids, then skirmishes, and finally full-scale wars that could devastate entire regions for years. The border stone was the ultimate antidote to this perilous uncertainty. It replaced subjective claim with objective fact. There could be no argument, no misinterpretation, and no accidental trespass when the line was literally set in stone for all to see. It removed the single greatest pretext for war, forcing rival powers to find another, less destructive way to resolve their differences. The fascinating relationship between Rome and Parthia offers a brilliant case study in how this worked in practice between two superpowers. For centuries, their vast empires shared a long, tense frontier in the Middle East, a region both coveted for its wealth and strategic value. While they fought several brutal wars, these were punctuated by long periods of an uneasy but stable peace. This stability was largely thanks to a network of recognized boundaries and neutral buffer zones, often marked by stones or other monuments. Neither empire ever formally accepted the other's ultimate right to be there. There was no grand peace treaty that ended their rivalry. Yet, the presence of these clear, physical markers created a de facto reality that both sides found it in their interest to respect. They established a set of rules for competition that stopped short of all-out war. A Roman legion would not cross a certain line, and in return, a Parthian cataphract would not venture beyond another. This unspoken agreement, anchored by visible markers, allowed for a tense but functional coexistence. It channeled their competition into controlled spheres of influence, proxy conflicts, and economic rivalry, preventing a perpetual and exhausting state of total war that would have bled both empires dry. The stones didn't create friendship, but they enforced a pragmatic and predictable set of limitations that served both sides' interests. The process of placing these stones was itself a profound exercise in preventative diplomacy, often requiring a level of compromise that was its own form of conflict resolution. The act rarely involved one party simply imposing its will upon the other. More often, it was a negotiated settlement, sometimes overseen by a neutral third party, like priests from a revered oracle such as Delphi. Representatives from both sides would walk the land together, arguing their cases, presenting their historical claims, and eventually finding a middle ground. The moment when both parties finally agreed on the spot to place the stone was a moment of profound significance. It was the physical manifestation of a hard-won consensus. By digging the hole and lowering the marker together, they were not just drawing a line, they were building a foundation for a new, more stable relationship. This collaborative act transformed the disputed territory from a potential battleground into a space of agreement. It was a ritual that acknowledged the interests of both sides and committed them to a shared future of mutual respect for that line. The stone became a monument to their successful negotiation, a permanent reminder that compromise had triumphed over conflict. This proactive approach reveals a sophisticated understanding of statecraft that feels remarkably modern. Ancient leaders intuitively grasped that it was far more effective and far less costly to prevent a fire than to fight one. Investing the time and resources in the meticulous, often frustrating process of survey and negotiation to place a border stone was a strategic investment in long-term stability. It was a recognition that the greatest strength of a ruler was not always measured in the size of his army, but in his ability to secure his borders so decisively that his army rarely needed to be used. The border stone, therefore, stands as the ultimate symbol of this preventative power. It is a testament to the idea that the most powerful weapon in diplomacy is not the sword, but the clear, unambiguous, and mutually respected agreement that makes drawing the sword unnecessary. It proves that true power lies not in the capacity for destruction, but in the wisdom to build structures that make destruction obsolete. Imagine the immense challenge facing an ancient surveyor. His task is to mark a perfectly straight line across miles of uneven, wooded, or hilly terrain, a line that must be so accurate and indisputable that it could prevent a war between two powerful kingdoms. He has no satellite imagery, no GPS, no laser theodolites. His tools are his knowledge of the stars, his understanding of simple geometry, and a handful of ingeniously designed instruments. This was the sophisticated science of ancient surveying, a discipline that transformed vague territorial claims into precise, legally binding borders etched permanently into the landscape. The success of a border stone depended entirely on the credibility of its placement, and that credibility was won through remarkable feats of early engineering and mathematics. Long before the Romans brought systematization to the process, early civilizations were developing their own methods. In the flat, sun-drenched plains of Mesopotamia, surveyors, known as Dub-Shah in Sumerian, likely relied on measured ropes made from reeds or leather and wooden poles for sighting line. The concept was elegantly simple, yet required immense skill. By creating large right-angled triangles using ropes knotted at precise intervals to form known lengths, they could project straight lines and perfect right angles across the featureless landscape, ensuring that the vast grid of irrigation canals and the fields they fed were divided with mathematical fairness. In Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile wiped the slate clean every year, erasing field boundaries and requiring a massive, state-sponsored resurveying effort. The Egyptians became masters of this art, using astronomy to align their boundaries with the cardinal directions. They could use the pole star or the sun's shadow to find true north, laying out their sacred temples and administrative districts with an accuracy that still astonishes archaeologists today. This was not guesswork. It was a highly respected profession that combined the roles of astronomer, mathematician, and priest, all in service of recreating cosmic order on Earth. But it was the Romans who elevated this practice to an industrial scale, transforming it into a cornerstone of their imperial project. The key to their success was the agrimensors, the Roman land surveyors. These were not mere laborers. They were an elite corps of military engineers and technicians, often veterans of the legions who were rewarded with land grants that they themselves would then meticulously measure out. Their most important tool was the groma, a deceptively simple-looking device that was, in fact, a masterpiece of precision. Imagine a vertical staff with a horizontal crossarm from which plumb bobs were suspended on strings. By sighting along the perfectly vertical strings, the surveyor could establish a straight line or, more crucially, a perfect right angle with unerring accuracy. A team of agrimensors would march across a new province, using the groma to lay out the famous grid system known as centuriation. They would first establish two main axes, the Cardo Maximus running north-south and the decumanus maximus running east-west. From this central crossroads, they would then mark out a vast grid of square plots, each called a centuria, measuring 20 acres about 710 meters on a side. At every key intersection, a boundary stone or terminus was planted, its inscription noting the number of the centuria and the name of the emperor under whom the land was allocated. The sheer scale and precision of this work is staggering. The evidence of Roman centuriation is still visible today in the landscape of northern Italy, southern France, and parts of North Africa, where country roads and field boundaries still follow the perfectly straight lines laid out 2,000 years ago. This accuracy was the bedrock of the border stone's authority. When two parties agreed to a boundary, they could be confident that the line was not arbitrary. It was the product of a rigorous scientific process that left no room for subjective interpretation. A farmer could not plausibly claim that the stone had shifted a few feet over the years, because its alignment with a dozen other stones miles away proved its position was correct. This eliminated the most common source of disputes before they could even begin, turning the marker from a potential object of contention into an accepted arbiter of truth. The credibility of the method bestowed credibility upon the agreement itself. This ancient expertise is the direct ancestor of our modern world. The techniques pioneered by the agrimensors establishing baselines, creating right angles, and using instruments to project lines over great distances formed the foundational principles of surveying for centuries. When European powers began to colonize the Americas, they used chains for measurement and compasses for direction, tools that were spiritual successors to the Roman ropes and gromas. The desire to precisely define and parcel the land was the same, only the technology had incrementally improved. The modern surveyors Transit and Theodolite are the high-tech grandchildren of the groma, and today's GPS satellites are the ultimate expression of that ancient drive to pin our claims to the Earth with absolute, unquestionable precision. The border stone was the original data point, the first fixed node in humanity's long quest to map and measure our world, proving that the lines we use to define our spaces today were drawn with the wisdom and ingenuity of the ancient world. Yet for all their power to create peace and order, these ancient markers also cast a long and often dark shadow, forcing us to confront a difficult ethical question: peace and stability for whom? The very act of drawing a line, of declaring "this is mine," is inherently an act of exclusion. While a border stone could brilliantly prevent conflict between two rival kings, it often did so by solidifying the power of the elite at the direct expense of the common people, the nomadic herder, or the indigenous community who had used that land for generations without the need for such rigid, permanent claims. The stone was a tool of the state, and the state's interests were rarely the same as those of every person living within its bounds. A farmer might gain security from knowing his field's boundaries were divinely protected, but what of the nomadic tribe whose traditional migratory routes were now abruptly severed by a line of stones they had no part in negotiating? Their entire way of life, which depended on seasonal movement across a wide landscape, could be destroyed overnight by a treaty they never saw, their ancestral lands suddenly redefined as the sovereign territory of a distant ruler they did not know. The peace achieved was a peace for the settled, the agricultural, the urban, a peace that could mean cultural extinction for those who moved across the land rather than owning pieces of it. This troubling duality becomes even starker when we look at the use of boundary markers in colonial contexts throughout history. The process often followed a familiar, grim pattern. A foreign power would arrive in a new land, frequently ignoring the complex and fluid territorial understandings of the native inhabitants. Using their own surveying tools and legal concepts, they would impose a rigid grid of property lines and political borders, carving up the landscape into lots that could be sold, taxed, and controlled. The famous Mason-Dixon line in 18th century America, for instance, was a feat of precise surveying intended to resolve a border dispute between two British colonies. Yet its creation paid no heed to the territories of the Native American nations who had lived on that land for centuries. It was a line drawn by and for European settlers, a tool for expanding their dominion and systematically displacing the people already there. The border stone, in this light, transforms from a symbol of agreement into an instrument of conquest, a physical manifestation of a power dynamic that declared one system of land ownership legitimate and all others invalid. It was the sharp edge of a bureaucratic process that often legitimized dispossession, turning the ancient tool of peace into a weapon for erasing entire cultures. This forces us to a crucial realization that echoes from antiquity straight into our modern debates. Borders are never, ever neutral. They are not simple lines on a map waiting to be discovered. They are active creations. They reflect the values, the priorities, and most importantly, the power structures of the societies that create them. A border stone placed by a pharaoh reflects a top-down, god-king authority. One placed by Roman surveyors reflects a highly bureaucratic, militarized, and legalistic state. One imposed by a colonial administrator reflects the extractive and expansionist goals of an empire. The stone itself is inert, but the process of its placement is deeply political. It always answers the question of who has the authority to draw the line, whose voice is heard in the negotiation, and whose claims to the land are considered valid and worthy of recognition. In every case, the marker benefits someone and disadvantages someone else. It creates insiders and outsiders, owners and trespassers, often based on rules that were written without the consent of all those affected. The profound lesson this history offers us is not that borders are inherently evil or that we should strive for a world without them. Such a vision is likely both unrealistic and ignores our deep-seated human needs for identity and security. Instead, the challenge is to learn from the past's failures and successes to create more just and inclusive processes for making and managing the lines that define our world. It calls for a modern diplomacy that consciously seeks out and incorporates the voices of all stakeholders, especially those of indigenous and local communities whose deep, generational knowledge of the land is an invaluable resource, not an obstacle to be overcome. It means recognizing that the most durable and ethical agreements are not those simply imposed by the most powerful, but those built on a foundation of mutual recognition and respect. The silent stones of the past, in all their complexity, stand as permanent witnesses to both our capacity for creating order and our capacity for injustice. They remind us that the true measure of a border's success is not just the absence of conflict it creates, but the presence of fairness it embodies for everyone whose life is shaped by its silent, unwavering presence. And so we arrive at the pressing question for our own time. What can these silent, weathered stones possibly teach us about the invisible, hyper-modern borders of the 21st century? We now navigate frontiers that would baffle a Roman surveyor. The shifting, contested lines of maritime exclusive economic zones, the entirely abstract boundaries of cyber warfare and data sovereignty, and the looming, uncharted territories of space. In a world where a border can be a line of code or a satellite's orbital path, the physical marker seems utterly obsolete. Yet, the core principles that made those ancient stones so effective, clarity, mutual recognition, and symbolic commitment, are more relevant than ever. They are the timeless pillars of any successful agreement, whether carved in granite or encoded in a digital handshake. Consider the tense and often ambiguous disputes over maritime boundaries. Nations squabble over exclusive economic zones that are invisible to the naked eye, their claims based on complex interpretations of international law and underwater continental shelves. These conflicts lack the simple, grounding presence of a stone on a riverbank, but imagine if the ancient principle of mutual recognition were applied more rigorously. What if rival nations, instead of sending naval vessels to shadow each other, jointly invested in the creation and maintenance of shared scientific monitoring stations or mutually operated navigation buoys precisely on the agreed-upon median line? These modern-day border stones would serve the same function as their ancient predecessors, a tangible, cooperative project that embodies the agreement itself, making violation a blatant and obvious act rather than a matter of fuzzy interpretation. It transforms an abstract line on a chart into a shared piece of infrastructure, fostering a practical relationship that can weather political storms. The challenge becomes even more profound in the realm of cyberspace, a domain with no physical geography at all. How do you create trust and establish rules of engagement in an environment defined by anonymity and deception? Here, the ancient use of ritual and symbolism offers a fascinating blueprint. Our digital agreements are currently sealed with electronic signatures efficient, but utterly devoid of any human ceremony or weight. Perhaps the future of cyber diplomacy requires the development of new digital rituals. Picture a scenario where two nations, after negotiating a treaty on cyber conduct, don't just email a PDF. Instead, their leaders participate in a jointly developed public cryptographic ceremony, a complex digital handshake that is visually represented and broadcast, creating a memorable, symbolic event that signifies commitment. This modern ritual would serve the same psychological purpose as the ancient act of sacrificing an animal over a newly placed boundary stone. It elevates a simple agreement into a sacred covenant, making its violation feel like a profound transgression rather than a simple breach of contract. It leverages the human need for ceremony to bolster the fragile architecture of digital trust. Looking even further ahead, the next great frontier is literally above us, the vast expanse of space. The existing Outer Space Treaty declares celestial bodies the province of all mankind. But as we move toward lunar mining and potential Mars colonization, the question of territory will inevitably arise. We are on the cusp of repeating all the old mistakes of terrestrial land grabs in a new environment. This is where the wisdom of the ancients could provide our most valuable guidance. Rather than letting corporate or national interests plant flags and claim resources unilaterally, the international community could establish a system inspired by the Roman agrimensors or the arbitrators of Delphi. We could create a neutral, international body tasked with surveying and parceling out resource rights on the moon according to agreed-upon, equitable principles, perhaps marking these claims with standardized, internationally recognized beacons. This would not be about claiming sovereignty, but about managing scarce resources to prevent conflict, the very same problem the Mesopotamians solved with their irrigation boundary stones. By proactively establishing clear, mutually recognized rules and markers before the competition begins, we can avoid the destructive scramble that has characterized so much of human territorial expansion on Earth. The most urgent application of all, however, may lie in the human displacement caused by climate change. As rising sea levels and desertification render vast tracts of land uninhabitable, we will face a crisis of borders and migration on an unprecedented scale. The rigid, exclusionary border policies of today will be catastrophically inadequate. We need to look back to the flexibility and nuance of ancient silent agreements. Could we develop modern frameworks that allow for temporary, seasonal, or crisis-driven migration across borders, based on pre-negotiated, reciprocal understandings rather than rigid, inflexible laws. This would mirror the ancient unspoken rules that allowed herders from rival kingdoms access to water during a drought. It requires a shift in mindset from seeing borders as immutable walls to viewing them as managed interfaces for human need, adapting to changing circumstances with a spirit of pragmatic cooperation. The goal would be to create systems that are both clear in their rules and compassionate in their flexibility, recognizing that the true purpose of a border is not to divide people, but to facilitate orderly and peaceful coexistence in a changing world. The stones of the past remind us that the most durable agreements are those that serve human needs, and as those needs evolve, so too must our wisdom in managing the lines between us. But this journey through history isn't just about understanding the past. It's about seeing its echoes in our own lives, right here and now. Think about your own neighborhood for a moment. Have you ever been out for a walk and stumbled upon an old, worn stone marker at the edge of a park, or noticed a strangely placed, moss-covered pillar that seems too deliberate to be just a random rock? That very well could be a modern descendant of those ancient boundary stones, a silent piece of history hiding in plain sight. Many towns and cities, especially in Europe and parts of North America, still have these historical markers embedded in their landscapes, often overlooked relics from centuries past that continue to define property lines or mark the old borders between parishes, estates, or even long-vanished towns. Discovering one is like finding a secret message from the past, a tangible connection to the people who walked that land before us and felt the same need to define their world. And it goes even deeper than physical objects. The unspoken agreements we've been exploring, those silent understandings that held ancient societies together, are not confined to history books. They are the invisible architecture of our own daily lives. We are all surrounded by a web of these modern silent agreements that we navigate every single day, often without even realizing it. Consider the simple act of waiting in a line. There's no written law that says you must stand patiently behind the person who arrived before you. It's a powerful, universally understood agreement that maintains order and fairness, preventing chaos in a crowded coffee shop or a busy bus stop. It's a boundary of courtesy respected by everyone who participates. Or think about the subtle, unwritten rules of a shared workspace, the quiet consensus on how loud to talk on the phone, or which shelf in the refrigerator is whose. These are the tiny, daily border stones of our modern existence, the agreements we make with each other to ensure a peaceful and cooperative coexistence. This is where the conversation truly comes alive, and we would love to hear your part in it. After this video, take a scroll through the comments. We're certain you'll find some fascinating stories from other viewers. Maybe someone from Scotland will share a photo of a centuries-old march stone they found on a hike, marking the ancient boundary between two clans. Perhaps a viewer from New England will describe the old stone walls crisscrossing the woods near their home, walls that started as property lines and now serve as a quiet reminder of the farmers who once cleared that land. Or maybe you'll recognize the silent agreements in your own life. What are the unspoken rules that shape your family, your workplace, or your community? How do you and your neighbors respect each other's space without ever having to have a formal meeting about it? Your stories and observations are the living continuation of this ancient human story. By sharing them, you're not just commenting on a video, you're adding your own marker to the vast, interconnected map of how we, as people, have always found ways to live together. So as we reach the end of our journey, it's clear these ancient stones were never just rocks. They were the physical embodiment of human ingenuity, a brilliant fusion of law, faith, and statecraft carved into the very earth itself. They transformed the chaotic, contested spaces between empires into organized, agreed-upon lines, turning the primal human instinct for territory into a sophisticated tool for building peace. From the divine curses on a Babylonian kudurrus to the precise grid of a Roman terminus, these markers were masterpieces of silent communication, encoding everything from sacred oaths to shared economic interests in their weathered surfaces. They were the original peace treaties, the first surveys, and in many ways the foundational stones of civilization as we know it, proving that some of our most enduring solutions are also our simplest. The true power of these artifacts lies in the profound, timeless truths they reveal about us. They show that whether in the Bronze Age or the digital age, human relationships ultimately hinge on the same fundamental pillars: trust, clarity, and mutual respect. A border stone made an agreement visible and permanent, raising the cost of betrayal and making the benefits of cooperation undeniable. It replaced the anxiety of ambiguity with the security of a clear, recognized line, freeing communities from the constant burden of vigilance and allowing them to channel their energy into building, trading, and creating. In their silent, steadfast presence, we see a deep understanding of human nature, our need for security, our yearning for order, and our incredible capacity to choose negotiation over conflict when given the right tools. And that is perhaps the most vital lesson these silent sentinels hold for our world today. In an era of satellite surveillance and cyber borders, it's easy to believe our challenges are entirely new. But the core dilemmas remain unchanged. How do we build trust with those who are different from us? How do we manage scarce resources without coming to blows? How do we create agreements that are both strong enough to last and flexible enough to adapt? The answers don't lie in more complex technology, but in revisiting the ancient wisdom of clarity, tangible commitment, and the power of a shared handshake, whether it's sealed in stone or in a meaningful ritual. As we face unprecedented global challenges, from climate migration to virtual frontiers, these age-old principles offer a compass. They remind us that the goal is not to build taller walls, but to draw clearer, fairer lines that honor our shared humanity and our profound connection to this planet and to each other. Thank you for exploring this fascinating corner of history with us. If this journey through the secrets of ancient diplomacy resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the mysteries that connect our past to our present. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever encountered a historical boundary marker, and what silent agreements shape your own world? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep